can already see on the screen who's next up, but I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to Richard Vlyth. He's going to be talking about the role of building design in solving the housing crisis, which sounds quite challenging. It's been argued that the reason communities object to new housing is because it is ugly. Well, that's quite a provocative statement to start with. I think Richard's quite well qualified to talk about this. He's been head of the Policy, Practice and Research Group at the RTPI since September 2011, where he established their new policy paper series, starting with housing in 2013 and also the special RTPI Centenary Planning Horizons Research Programme with 5 projects in 2014, so quite a lot under his belt. I think, apart from leading the team, he's also concentrating on Brexit at the moment, so we should all be a little sympathetic, as well as the Letwin Review. So without further ado, Richard.
I spend a lot of time in our regional network, and I suppose I should say, on behalf of RTPI East, that we also have an award scheme which is currently open, and please enter that. We have an accredited planning school in which I am now standing, and we have a programme of events, and Stacey, who's here, can explain any of those if you'd like to know what's coming up in RTPI East in the next 6 months. The RTPI generally shouldn't require any explanation even to RIBA members, because we're kind of the sister organisation, or actually daughter organisation, I should say, really, because RIBA set the RTPI up. We have, alongside the things that Tom mentioned, we have an urban design network. So for our members that are particularly interested in design, we have a specialised network and a bulletin and a community of practice for them. Tom also mentioned Brexit. The one thing that has really kicked off collaboration between the RTPI and the RIBA is Brexit. So it takes nothing but an external threat to get everybody working together. And we've issued a number of statements since the referendum, particularly around issues of great importance to architecture, around access to international talent, issues of great importance to the RTPI, which is that we must oppose a drive to the bottom in environmental standards. Are we prepared as a nation to see our environment trashed simply in order to be able to sell cars to the United States? I would hope not. So, and we've also, that sort of collaboration has been involved with the surveyors, RICS, and the Chartered Institute of Building. So I've learned a lot about things like the diameter of rainwater pipes and the importance of being able to go on using the same products across Europe for buildings, and the difficulty it will be if we started diverging, started using, say, feet and inches again. Wouldn't that be an exciting prospect? So that's the sort of plug about what the RTPI is and how it fits in with RIBA. And now onto the politics. Well, I like architects and modern buildings, and I'm quite concerned about the idea that the architecture profession and design generally is somehow being held to account for certain things that are going on. For example, the idea that council estates were badly designed and therefore that it's the design of them that's a problem, and not particularly taking into account a whole series of other questions around, say, benefits. I'm a governor of a primary school in central London. Our whole operation as a primary school has been severely disrupted by the government's benefits policy, which is pitchforking people out of the catchment area into cheaper parts of London where they're deemed suitable for them to live. Perish the thought that people who need support from the government should dare to live anywhere near Zone 1. So very difficult to run a primary school in situations where your parents are being kicked out of the area. So the issue of estates and that awful term, sink estate, I think is a very serious question as to what are the causes of problems, and what are the possible scapegoats for those problems, and where does design fit into this? And it's connected also to this whole question of new buildings and their role, and what is the kind of politics around design and how it fits into development. And many of you may well have heard of the Create Streets think tank, an organisation supported by the Legatum Institute, which you may have also heard of, very famous think tank in connection with all sorts of interesting policies going on around Brexit. And their argument is that if houses looked nicer, then people would agree to having them in their area. And here's their survey: a margin of more than 4-1. The public say that if you design ugly houses, then we will oppose them as, and that's called NIMBYism. And I think this is a very difficult situation for architects to have to deal with, and also for development management planners as well. My concern, I suppose, is that there is a lot more to opposition to housing and the whole issue of getting housing right than simply what it looks like, important though that is, and also important though it is for it to be, as Andy said, functional and safe. But anyway, as you can see, this agenda is massively influential. So this has been an exciting week for the Conservative Party and politics, but this is what the Prime Minister said in her manifesto. This is immensely specific. For a government party manifesto dealing with everything, it wasn't that long, dealing with everything in the entire panoply of government activity, it actually has time to say mews houses and terraced streets. I wonder why. I wonder which people have been influencing other people. And this is an extraordinary thing to say, given that we've been hearing that the government is encouraging good design, which is great, but good design includes a lot of things. It's quite interesting that the party says mansion blocks, mews houses and terraced streets. But what have other people said about planning, new building and attitudes towards it? The Centre for London did an interesting survey which was called Stopped, if you read these red letters. So they said, what are the reasons why people don't like things happening around them, like new housing and so on? We've heard from the councillor from Rochford, actually, the strain on services is the key point. People don't like the fact that they can't get into their GP surgeries because of the imposition of new housing. There's a huge story I could tell you. I wrote a blog on the NHS and planning a while back, but there isn't time now to go into the fascinating anecdotes around that story. Trust. People feel that they don't know what's happening, and it's also connected to the engagement point, that they're afraid of what's happening. They feel that power is being taken away from their hands. Regrettably, possibly, people are concerned about outsiders coming into the area. Will it change the character? Will it mean that people don't feel that they're at home when they walk around the streets? Very difficult issues to deal with when we are also a country that has had until now open borders, and where we also need to accommodate a lot of change, particularly in urban and as indeed in rural areas. We've been hearing the impact of people who aren't from your area. Why are they here? Why are they moving in? Then the design issue is under place identity. So there it is. It's number 4. These aren't incidentally in order of important. It's not that the services is most, but place is there under P because that's how the word stopped works. But yeah, people don't necessarily like to see their place changing. People are conventional a lot of the time in urban design terms. They like seeing a house that's like theirs opposite them, and that's has to be understood. And I think that is what Theresa May was getting at. It's just quite interesting that she was very specific about it, but it's an important point. Politics hijacked. So one of the problems around particularly planning, and all planners here will know, is when something gets hijacked to do something else. So like, for example, the Habitats Directive, a lot of supporters of the Habitats Directive really like it because they don't like new housing. They're not that particularly worried about newts. They're mainly worried about change. Engagement, we could all do more of it, and there's actually an issue connected to resources in planning, but how do you make sure that there's enough discussion with people about what's happening, and do they feel involved? There is actually an interesting clutch of development management customer satisfaction surveys I've been gathering from different councils who've been prepared to give them to me, like asking people, even though the planning decision went against you as a neighbour, were you happy with the way that the process had been handled? Even though the process went against you as a developer, did you feel that the process was handled fairly? And there's some quite interestingly high results for those satisfaction surveys, which I think is a great credit to the way over the last 30 years planning departments have really raised their game in terms of customer services. And finally, the temporary question that actually, I mean, there's going to be a building next to my building. I'm going to look forward to 7 or 8 months of construction happening in the plot next door. It's looking good that it seems that they're going to choose the winter to do it. So we've been able to enjoy the last few weeks of not having construction going on next door. But this is inevitable, but it's also something that can be managed so that neighbours are helped. The academics have pitched into this as well. So we know why do people oppose development? Academics say impact on local infrastructure and services. I almost feel like putting a full stop between each one of those words like it's a tweet. It's a massive challenge, and if you're talking about places like Surrey, for example, and also the parts of Essex which are on the borders of London, there has been for 50 years or so an increasing intensity of development despite the existence of the green belt. And relatively prosperous areas are kind of often in the back of the queue for specific interventions because on indices of deprivation, those areas don't feature very much, but when it comes to getting people into schools and getting people into GP appointments, even without changing greenbelt boundaries, the intensification of places and perhaps the changing from a single occupancy older person in a 5-bedroom house to a house with 5 car drivers and maybe young children massively alters the drain on public services, even if you haven't had a planning permission, because it's the same house. So this is kind of what people feel on the front line around the question of additional development, and a lot of it is not much to do with what it looks like, although that is part of it. I think one of the things actually that is a particular concern is that in the 50s, I think maybe both professions could hold their hands up as thinking that if you got the drawing right, then the life would be right. And this was because we'd come out of a depression in which people had houses where there were no loos, had houses where they were damp, they were unsafe, they were drafty. It was easy to understand that in the 50s people thought in the bright new world of rebuilding Britain after the war, that the drawings would mean that the lives were right. And at the same time, we also invented the green belt, which was very much on the same principle. It's sort of what it looks like will then lead to the right kind of lives. So if we keep a lot of the land around London open, people will go and walk in it. Actually, a lot of them don't. They go to Westfield or Bluewater, or they watch the match on TV. So it's interesting, you can have your ideas about the physical appearance of things, but actually society doesn't always work that way. Society goes and does other things that the designers don't want. So I won't go into it now, but the RTPI's view on greenbelts is that one of the problems with them is thinking them as something that it's what it looks like that counts. And a lot of the opposition to greenbelts has been, but they don't look nice. And I think that's a huge distraction from the issue, which is much more to do with about how places function and about, as I was saying with the school, how different people in society get proper outcomes for themselves, which is not an appearance thing, it's a deeper thing. So what does the RTPI think about all this stuff? Well, I suppose what we would say is that it's about civic design and it's about city regional design. So the first thing to get right is, are developments happening in the right places? There's not much point having a fantastically well-designed new village, which you can't get to except by car, and where there are no jobs, and basically it's a housing estate, even though when you get there it may tick all the current sustainability boxes. So the most important thing is that your city region is planned properly, and this is a big challenge in a situation where we have a lot of independent councils, but I think there are some exciting things happening now, and the government has been, particularly the Cameron government, was very keen to encourage more cooperation, combined authorities working together, not by top-down imposition of ministers waving a wand and saying, thou art all combined into a clump, but rather come together. And if you come together, like Oxfordshire has and Cambridgeshire has, then the government will step in and do stuff for you in return for the cooperation on additional growth that you've agreed. And we just published at the same time as our response on the NPPF this paper on why this wider question of where development happens matters. It matters for 4 reasons, so there are 4 chapters. It makes city regions more economically productive if they're planned properly at the greatest scale. It helps achieve climate change targets. It's useful for public health, and it enables you to address an aging population and its challenges. It may seem very attractive if you're my age to go and live in the country. 20 years on, if you no longer want to drive and your family no longer is able to visit you because they can't get there because you're in just a remote place, is the massive dispersion of the population into the countryside, which is one of the consequences of the drive for as many housing permissions as possible. One of the consequences of that is that we may end up with a lot of people living in places they can't get out of, especially if they can't drive. So that there's an ageing aspect to urban form as well. Now, some of you may have been lucky enough to pick up some evidence on this at the desk when we came in, because I printed them off, so I'll come on to this in a minute. But these are our national statistics, where we looked at the sustainability of the National Planning Policy Framework. We are the only people who have done this. We called through the Select Committee, the CLG Select Committee as it then was, for the government to analyse the sustainability of the 2012 NPPF. It has not been done, so we as a poverty-stricken charity dug deep and decided that we would measure the sustainability of the NPPF. The methodology is quite complicated, and it's also quite crude, I have to say, because we have a tiny budget for this. Our members have to pay for all of this ourselves. We get no government grants. But one of the things that we did find was that in terms of transport sustainability, the NPPF was doing okay, could do better. I think a real question here is whether the single-minded drive for the housing delivery test and as many planning permissions as possible may put some of this into jeopardy. So this is one of the reasons why you need someone monitoring this and keeping a close eye, which we intend to do in future, on is the sustainability of the housing permissions that are happening going to be maintained as we drive, and as we should be doing, driving for there being more houses. Now, this is the thing. Now, you should, if you're lucky and you got one of these when you came in at the desk, this is the A3 sheet of the Cambridge City Region analysis on NPPF sustainability. We did one for 12 city regions. Cambridge was chosen because of its significance for growth and because it's in the east of England. We had to have one in the east of England. The Cambridge one is actually very interesting because it shows on a huge increase in sustainability, which is actually rather surprising and not typical. So in the first 3 years of the NPPF, barely any new permissions for housing were granted within 800 metres of a railway station in the Cambridge City region, but by 2015 to 17, over 55% of the planning permissions were being granted with access to significant public transport. And you can see this because the permissions in the second round are the red ones, the permissions in the first round, the orange ones. So some of the stuff that's happening along the Great North Railway line and the A1, like Alconbury and places in the west of the city region, are giving those good figures on sustainability. That's enough of the sort of stats and stuff. The real question for us today is how planning departments are going to deal with the housing pressures and the need to achieve good design. And I suppose the first thing is that we need qualified planners to do this. That might sound obvious, but actually quite a lot of planners are not qualified. We need to support accredited planning schools. This is one. The RTPI has now opened up routes to membership to make it easier for people who are not able or haven't had a conventional university education to become chartered planners. as part of that process, we are pushing for apprenticeships. We have, I think I'm old, so I would call it an HND apprenticeship, but the apprenticeship for people around 18. That program is now operating in different parts of the country and enables you to come straight out of school into planning apprenticeship and work. The graduate apprenticeship program is the subject of a very high-profile appeal against the government's Institute for Apprenticeships, which refused our graduate apprenticeship scheme, and we are pressing that appeal because we think at the moment, at the moment it's extraordinary that given the issue around housing that we don't encourage the apprenticeships as a way of getting into planning. This is a publication that I also have put on the outside desk, which is the status of planners, and we are concerned that compared to that 50s era when design was kind of king, one of the issues is that planners are not being accommodated at the top table in local authorities. So this shows that roughly on average among the authorities that we studied, which are from these selection of English regions and countries in the UK and Ireland, that it's around a quarter of local authorities that would put a planner at the top table, and that was reporting directly to the chief executive in the authority. Interestingly, the Republic of Ireland is coming out at 80%. Lots of reasons to envy Ireland at the moment, and that might be one of them. But anyway, we are going to delve. This is quite a sort of rapid fire piece of research that we didn't publish, and you can pick up the hard copies of that outside. We are going to look into what's underneath this. Why is it happening? Can it be changed? What does it matter? But I think placemaking and planning needs to have representatives of the senior executive teams. The other thing that we've published, which I haven't got a slide for, is reports on the planning departments in the southeast of England and the northwest of England. And I just got 8 points that I can read out. What we found in that 6-month study of actual planning departments individually was that people think that training is a great benefit for working in a local authority, but actually, unfortunately, recently training budgets have been almost entirely removed. Again, this is a time of a housing crisis. The increase in planning fees that the government gave us of 20% following lobbying from organisations such as mine is kind of fine, but it just about returns you to 2012 in terms of inflation. So it doesn't actually deal with increasing capacity, although it is good that it was required to be ring-fenced. Because planning authorities must process planning applications, but they don't kind of have to do local plans. That'll be an interesting issue to discuss. One of the consequences is that the resources in the planning departments are increasingly being focused on getting the decisions out, and that does mean that some of the other stuff in some places is not being given the focus that perhaps it should be. But nevertheless, 87% of planning applications decided in 13 weeks nationally. Recommendations, as I've said, planning should be at the top table in local authorities. The head of planning should be a statutory position, which is something the RTPI in Scotland is seeking to have in the new planning bill. There should be collaboration across local authority departments, not just central government that finds it difficult to talk across departments. Actually, quite a lot of organisations find that difficult. There should be investment in local authority staff by their councils, helping them, for example, get chartership. Very difficult, actually, to progress to chartership in local authorities compared to in the private sector. Issue, why would that be? And then finally, and kind of rather obviously, invest in digital technology in relation to planning applications. But again, that's a big upfront cost. And one of the reasons why there's been a lot of outsourcing in local authorities is partly because outsourcing companies have come and said, well, look, if you need £1 million to invest in your development management system, we'll give it to you, but then we kind of want the business afterwards. And that's an issue about, how do you find the money to improve your processes? Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Some interesting food for thought there. We're going to now open up to Q&A again, so sorry to put you on the spot.
Fair enough.
I suppose one of the interesting points you raised was about the the green belt and the purpose that it serves, and it looking nice and being able to walk in it. Obviously, one of the projects that was mentioned earlier was northwest Cambridge, on the outskirts of Cambridge, which was built within the green belt, and seems to have gone down quite well. So, provocatively speaking, should we just get rid of the green belt? Do you think it serves a useful purpose in its current form?
Well, what the RCBI has asked for is that the green belts should have an additional purpose. Because, as I say, the current ones are all very deterministic. They're quite physical. We think that there should be a social purpose of green belts, which means that you then do evaluate things like what is the impact of the green belt on affordability of housing? What is the impact of the green belt on access to recreation? Because its critics say we've got these pesticide-filled fields where no one can actually go. Was that the intention of the founders? Not sure. And also the critics saying, let's sweep it away, when you say to them, well, how many more people would be able to afford houses in your district if there was no green belt? Where's the modelling economically of what would happen if we didn't have a green belt round, say, Brentwood? And they can never tell me. Because as we know, the price of houses is determined by the price of second-hand houses. The actual number of people who will be priced into housing if you relax the green belt around a given city is very few, unless you were able to keep on doing it for about 25 years, by which time there may be a measurable impact. So one of the questions, the reason for a social purpose of green belts is actually to say, if we were to see a change in green belt policy, how can we ensure, for example, that is used to facilitate affordable housing of different kinds, rather than simply say, well, let's get lots of rich people to come in and buy houses in the green belt under some kind of theoretical principle that if there were more houses everywhere, eventually that would trickle down to lower prices, which it won't for a very long time.
Thank you for the mention about Rochford. This is just a question on design, actually. And I wanted to know, what do you think about design? Would it pass in an emotional test? And by that, will it promote a positive, feel-good, emotional response or a negative one? And would you be wanting to be looking at design in that way? Because, I mean, I look at it, if I go to a place and I see it, I'm either going to get, I wouldn't want to live here, or I love it. And I wonder if that's something that architects and designers take into effect, the personal feeling that human beings have.
Well, I'm not the best person. I know there's many people in this room who are better answering that question than me. One statistic that comes to mind, I've showed some of them. I mean, it is clearly a factor in people's appreciation of other people's development, but I think you're also touching on the fact that is it better for people to live in good design for themselves? You know, when the new arrivals need good design, it's not just a question of satisfying the existing population. And there are more studies than I could work. The one I'm just thinking of is the famous one about the hospitals and the trees, where, you know, the hospital ward that looked out over greenery led to faster recovery. It's interesting, whenever I go into hospitals, they always put the heads of the beds facing inwards, because it's easier to provide care that way. But it's curious, isn't it, that you would do that when, so sometimes there is a nice view, but you know, you're ill, you can't sort of crane round to see it. So I'm not really the best one on that, but you know.
Hi, Lewis Herbert. I work here and I'm also a leader of Cambridge City Council, so I was very interested in your analysis. There's an awful lot said about garden villages and about developing new settlements, and certainly in the east-west arc there's been a big focus on that. Shouldn't there be more of a sequential test, Richard, in terms of some of the points that you've made? Without wading straight into a greenbelt argument, aren't urban extensions better than garden villages?
That's an impossible question to answer, because it all depends where you are, and also I have to be very careful, because if I say things about particular places in particular regions, then it gets assumed that I'm responding to particular projects. So generally speaking, incrementalism isn't a great idea. So changing the settlement boundaries, you know, one house at a time, particularly that leads to people feeling very vulnerable because they don't know what's happening next. It's the nibbling away problem of settlement boundaries. The other question is the issue of providing infrastructure. So one house makes very little contribution to developer contributions for infrastructure. It's very difficult to make that work, even with the community infrastructure levy. And so it's easier to provide infrastructure on a large scale in relation to large sites. But I can't really be drawn on the question as to whether those should be large sites inside areas, on the edge of them, or entirely freestanding. I think that's an issue which has to be worked out according to the local evidence. The one thing I suppose is interesting about the ARC, though, and about HS2 is that if you are already building a lot of transport infrastructure for other reasons, for connectivity, then surely what you'd want to do is make the most of it to provide connected new settlements. There's no station on HS2 between Old Oak Common and the Midlands. The one they're going to open near Birmingham Airport, Network Rail HS2 Limited, wanted to build a station with a very large car park and a bus shelter on either side of the railway for people to shelter in while they were waiting for the train. The people in the area said, well, hang on a minute, locally led, what we want is to build a city, not a bus shelter. We don't want another Ebbsfleet International, which still, after 20 years of being open, is basically still a car park and a railway station. We want something which is the centre of a place. So we want offices, we want employment, we want very many houses, and that's quite interesting. It's called UK Central. Hopefully it will clear the right hurdles, because there's a lot of political issues to go through and there's greenbelt issues, but that's interesting in terms of if you're making investments anyway, why not make the most of them?
It was just a quick question, really. I really liked the model that you put up around the Centre for London with the stopped word, and it was the trust that really resonated with me. So as a local authority planner working in policy, do a lot in terms of community consultation, specifically around large housing allocations, and I'm a firm believer that meaningful engagement can really only ever happen when you have informed stakeholders. And one of the things that I find is a lot of communities and young people are not appropriately informed about what planning is, why it's important to them, why they should certainly get engaged at that stage. Now, and there's a lack of sort of capacity and knowledge in terms of how the system works and how you can intervene and have that meaningful dialogue with local authority planners. The RTPI have loads of great resources. A lot of them are directed primarily towards professionals such as myself, so you're almost like you're preaching to converted. I just wanted to know what the RTPI are doing in terms of outreach, specifically looking at sort of communities, young people, trying to get them interested and excited around working with planners to help shape their environments in a positive way.
Absolutely masses. Depending which age group, there's a game, there's the Planet game for younger people. If you're interested in doing that, we have an ambassadors program, so you can sign up to work in schools with our resources and take the message to those schools that will let you in to speak for half an hour or 40 minutes or however long it is. So our education department's doing a lot. We've got a specifically dedicated member of staff now around helping people be aware that at the age of 18 they could choose planning as a career. That's connected slightly, and there's also a great video on that. It's also slightly connected to the point you're talking about, which is that even if you don't choose it as a career for yourself, you need to know about it as a citizen. And that program actually does the same thing, because basically it faces two ways. It both tries to attract people into the profession, and it also makes other people aware of what planning does. I was very disappointed. I went to my school for a reunion, and I went to the geography department, and it said, things you can do with geography. Planning wasn't mentioned anywhere, which I think is disgraceful, especially since I am an alumnus, and they might have taken the trouble to work out the things you could do with A-level geography. But anyway, so there's a long way to go, and one of the things that's difficult, I think, is when the planner at a party sort of story is very interesting, because you say what you do and everyone says, that sounds very, very interesting. So you're the people that make sure that there's enough healthcare and schools to go alongside housing development, and I sort of feel like saying, I wish that was what happens, but actually, unfortunately, those decisions are made by other organisations, which is the point around coordination of infrastructure. So if we can talk later, I can give you the links to all the stuff in the education programme that is available.
I'm afraid we've actually run out of time. I'm very sorry. There's a very eager question there. Perhaps over the lunch break you'll be able to get together. Sorry, we're going to have to. Thank you again, Richard, for that.